Welcome everybody. I'm going to get straight into it. I am expecting more people on the call, so as they come in, I'll just admit them and they will drop in. So it would be lovely if you just pop in the chat box. It'd be really, I'm really curious to know where you're calling from. I know I have clients here. I have people that I've done presentations for before. There's some people here that have come through professionally from organisations. So it'd be great to get a feel for the room, just to see, are you someone that's here tonight because you're deeply in grief, or are you someone that works professionally in grief? And let me be clear, most of us that work professionally in grief have our own grief. It's, you know, it kind of comes part and parcel in that field, but not always. So it would be really interesting just to see whether you're working professionally, whether you're supporting someone, or whether you're actually a griever yourself. So if you could just pop that in the chat box, that would be really useful just for me, because then I know who I'm talking to, and just so that I can make everything really relevant for the room as best that I can. Both yes, both yes. Great. Okay. Both yes. Great. Both, right. Well, that you're in the right place, because this conversation will talk to both those who are grieving, but also to those who are in those support roles. Hi, Melanie. Currently grieving. Yes, yes. All right, so let's get into it. So let me share my screen and get started. So thank you for all being here on time. As I said, I probably might get a few more people coming in, so I will admit them as they come. If you see me looking over here, I'm operating off two different screens. So just so that you're aware, I am very conscious that the camera is here. However, I've got a few things going on. So it's awesome to have you here. When it comes to grief, it is such a critically important conversation, because, and it's not a conversation that enough of us have. You know, I know when grief hit my world, and I'll talk about that a little bit more shortly, it totally blindsided me. Absolutely blindsided, had no idea about grief, no idea how to support myself in grief, and nobody knew how to support me either. So it was such a big deal. And yet grief is something that affects us all. It affects everybody. You know, the statistics will show that on average, every 8 to 9 years, we will experience a deep loss. Every 8 to 9 years. Now, that's an average, of course, for some people. You know, Melanie said she's forever in grief, or whatever that was. And I know that she's had a few in a row. And so it's different for everybody, of course, but just understand that it does happen. For anybody who believes, you know, grief will never affect them, they're just deluding themselves. Grief is a conversation that we need to be having. It's an incredibly important conversation, and you know, grief is part of being alive. So I do share a lot of really rich content throughout this presentation. I really encourage you to take notes, because I'm pretty fast. I go through pretty quickly. So take lots of notes. It's really important to take those notes. That movement will help you remember. Also, I really encourage you to think of lots of questions. I'll take the questions at the end, but really encourage you to ask lots of questions along the way. Love questions. So it's really important, especially when we talk about grief, that we provide a safe space. So anyone who's in grief, I just want you to understand, which is probably the majority of the people here, is that you may get triggered in this conversation tonight. It's a tough conversation. And if you're carrying grief in your body, even if it's from 30 years ago, that grief can resurface. So please understand that if that happens, just lean in, just feel what you need to feel. Don't push it away, just accept it. I love tears. I feel like tears are a gateway to our soul. They show us that this matters to us. And so it's really important that you show up however you are. If you're angry, be angry. If you're frustrated, be frustrated. If you feel numb, be numb. If you're in shock, that's okay too. It really doesn't matter. If you're in sort of the throes of grief, grief brain's a real thing. So please just take lots of notes. When those triggers come up, I really encourage you to lean into them, because the triggers are like a map to our pain. They show us where our pain is. And the more curious you can get about those triggers and lean into them, it's almost like it's a map to our healing as well. So whilst it shows us where the pain is, when we can recognize where the pain is, we can then begin to identify where we need to do our healing and what we need to do in order to heal. So look for the triggers, find the triggers, because they are the map to your healing. Now, we're going to be covering a lot tonight in a very short amount of time, so I'm going to get into it. We'll be talking about grief, tips for coping and healing. This is a little bit out of order. When grief is traumatic, the grief timeline, and tips for supporting others. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about how to process deep emotions. Now, before I do that, I do want to introduce myself because I've not met everybody that's here. And I think it's really important for you to understand a little bit about my background. I'm not going to spend long here, clearly, but this is just to give you a bit of an idea of the experience that I have, not to impress you, but to really emphasize that I am the real deal. I do know what I'm talking about. I've been through this grief journey. I am a certified grief educator. I'm a moderator in a grief support group. I don't know how many of you have heard of David Kessler. He's a world-renowned grief expert, in my opinion, the number one. He's co-authored books with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Louise Hay. So I work with him in his grief support group in America. I have been training, facilitating, educating for over 30 years now. My background is human resources and organizational development. I've worked with leaders around the country. I started my career as a O operator 35 years ago. So I've been in trauma and grief and working with people in really challenging situations pretty much my entire life. I'm a qualified life coach. I'm also a qualified results coach, and I'm a self-directed healing practitioner. Self-directed healing is a healing modality that works with really deep emotional pain. It's organic, it's true. It's very holistic, and we move that energetically through the physical body. So that is the process that I will be taking you through at the end. I'll be taking you through a group healing. Now, in addition to being a self-directed healing practitioner, I'm actually the global trainer. So I train practitioners worldwide, and I've trained practitioners from Texas to Iraq and New Zealand through to Florida. So you name it, I've trained people. I've trained psychiatrists, psychologists, educators, nurse educators, therapists, healers, hypnotherapy, you name it, I've trained them. And so I come with a lot of experience to the table. Recently, I have received a lot of recognition for my work here in Australia. Actually last week I received news that I'm a 2023 Australian Women's Small Business Champion Award finalist. So I'm very proud of myself. It's quite a big journey. Thank you. to achieve that sort of recognition. And I say this not to brag, I say this because in an industry like coaching and healing, this is really important because coaching and healing is not a regulated industry. And so this is how we show, it's like external people and come in and view our business, our structures, the way we do our professional development, the quality, how we support our environment and our community. There's many different lenses that need to be viewed in these types of awards, and to be selected as a finalist with over 2,500 applications, it's quite a big deal. So I'm really, really proud of that. And so the awards night is, I think it's September, end of September. So that's just a little bit about what I've done. Now, as I said, I will take questions at the end, so please write them down. Any questions that you have, write them down and I'll capture them at the end. Okay. Now, when it comes to grief, you know, we all have our stories, we all have our pain. And, you know, for me personally, I didn't just wake up and decide, hey, I'm going to be an expert in grief. It didn't really happen that way. It's like in my world, grief, I feel like grief chose me. And I wonder for those of you, because many of you said that you're working in this space, how many of you feel that as well? Do you feel that grief chose you? And through your experience, there's a depth, there's a maturity, there's a growth that comes through that you can then share and help other people on that journey as well. That's how I very much feel. For me, I was working as a life coach back in 2020, and I was away at a festival. I was at the Seven Sisters Festival, and I received a call. It was 6:30 in the morning from my daughter. And, you know, you get Sometimes you just get this feeling, I knew something was wrong, didn't know what it was. And anyway, my 18-year-old son, Aaron, had been in a car accident, and Aaron died on scene. And so literally in the blink of an eye, the very foundations of my world imploded. Life as I knew it, I knew in that moment that my life would never, ever be the same. And the pain that followed, the grief that followed, like for those of you who have experienced deep loss, you'll know what I'm talking about. Even though we all experience it differently, it's very hard to articulate that level of pain. I've got some photos of my boy. Let me share them with you. This is my boy, Aaron. And so, you know, for someone so loving and cheeky and charismatic and full of life, he was so full of life. And then all of a sudden to be gone, it's absolutely tragic. Here one moment, gone the next. In the blink of an eye, your whole world changes. And so, as I said, you know, it's very hard to articulate this depth of pain. I love sharing photos and images of him because it matters. You know, his life matters. I wouldn't be here today without him. And so it's taken me on this journey where, for me as a coach, I needed to learn how to understand my grief. I needed to learn how to process that pain. And that's the journey that I went on. Now, I knew, even though I was an experienced life coach, that I knew absolutely nothing, like zero about grief. And I was a mindset coach. Like, I thought I was nailing it. It just made me realize how little I knew. And not only how little I knew, how little everybody else knew. You know, we're not trained how to access, we're not trained how to process this pain. We don't know how to move energy like that through our body when it's that deep and it's that traumatic. And it's like grief is this massive big gap in our conversation, in our dialogue here in society. Why aren't we having these conversations? Why are we uncomfortable when someone's in grief? Why do we try to fix them and make them feel better? Why aren't we comfortable just sitting with the pain? And so I don't get it, you know, like, we will all die. This happens. And so we need to understand this grief journey. We need to have these conversations. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this work. Now, I've learned many things on this journey, and I'm continuing to learn. I will always learn. And one of those things is that in life, tragic things can happen, and they do happen. And so that's why it's so important to be learning this stuff. In addition to that, I've also learned how very precious life is. It's so precious. And the challenge with grief is many people just shrink down, go into their shell. They don't know how to process their pain. And life as they knew it, yes, it'll never be the same, but it doesn't mean you can't still have a good life. And so my work is, how can we still live a good life despite life? How can we still tap into our potential? How can we still have fun? How can we have joy? How can we love again? How can we connect with those things that really deeply matter? So we can't change the fact that someone or something that we care about has gone, but we actually do have choices about how we decide to respond and how we move forward. And so that's what this conversation is about. It's about learning to be courageous grievers. It's about, for those of you working with grievers, how to help them in that journey and be that support person for them along the way. Now, I choose how I respond. I'm an active griever. I call myself a courageous griever. I choose to empower myself. And I do that through knowledge. I do that through learning. I do that through working out how to heal and how to sit with my pain and allow it rather than pushing it away. I choose to understand my grief. I choose to continually process, to show up, to serve others. Because for me, I mean, that's not everyone's model of healing, but for me, I find that very rewarding. And it's also a beautiful way that I can honor my son, I can honor Aaron, and I can bring him with me on the journey. So part of my work and part of my grief journey for me, it's how do I create a new relationship with him moving forward? So rather than having to say goodbye, how can I reconnect with him and create a new relationship with him so he's with me forever? So I'm continually connected with him. And so it's about learning how to move your way through the pain to reclaim that power. And I call that post-traumatic growth. Most importantly, I've learned how to feel deep emotional pain, how to process trauma, and how to do that in natural, holistic ways. If I hadn't learned how to process this pain, if I hadn't have discovered self-directed healing and learned how to move that energy through my body, I would not be in a position that I am today to be able to help people and to be showing up as regularly, consistently, and as healthily as I am. So let's move on. What is grief? What is grief? Now, there's many definitions to grief, but I like this definition. Grief is the loss of something, and grief in its purest form is an expression of love. Because if you didn't care, it wouldn't hurt. And if you didn't love, you wouldn't grieve. So if you weren't connected to that, you wouldn't be grieving. It really, to me, it is that simple. So I like to think of grief as love. It's our love. It's a normal human reaction when we experience a loss. Now, when we lose someone we love or something we love, we will grieve. That's inevitable. Now, grief has many, many faces. There's death, of course, but there's so many other ways that we can grieve as well. There's relationship breakdowns, divorce, betrayal, estrangement. I posted something about child loss not that long ago, and someone commented, "My children aren't dead, but I don't get to see them." And the grief that they're experiencing over that estrangement is really significant. There's severe illness, health, disabilities, job loss, career, business changes, restructures. There's natural disasters. People lose their belongings. People become homeless. There is so much grief around birth, miscarriages, infertility, birth trauma. The statistics show that 1 in 3 women experience birth trauma. Doesn't mean their child died. It means that the birth was traumatic and there's a sense of loss in that. Because let me tell you, every trauma has grief. There's something was lost in that experience. Not all grief has trauma, but every trauma has grief. I'll talk about that shortly in a bit more detail. And pets, our pets. I've worked with many people who have lost their pets and they are not coping. You know, are people's dogs. They're, you know, man's best friend, women's best friend. They're not called our best friends. Now, remembering if grief is love, it's the connection that we have. The more we love, the more it hurts. Now, that's just some. There's many, many more. And for today's conversation, I'll be focusing on death, the loss of grief when someone we love dies. However, I just want to be very clear that this information that I'm sharing, this grief education, it is applicable and relevant to all forms of grief. All forms of grief. It's the same way that we process. Now, when it comes to grief, it hurts, like really hurts. It hurts us physically, mentally, it hurts us emotionally, spiritually, energetically. Like it hurts on all layers of our physical being. Physically, there can be so many different symptoms, and this is going to be different for everybody, but it can increase inflammation in your body. It can increase blood pressure. There's a higher risk because of that of blood clots. There's a condition called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which is also known as broken heart syndrome. It's an inflammation in the heart. It mimics anxiety, panic attacks. It can mimic a heart attack as well. It's where everything pumps in the heart a bit differently. I had that came through. I wasn't diagnosed, didn't need to be diagnosed, but I know that I had that. So and the other thing is that health problems that you already have, they can be exacerbated. So not only can it cause new ones, but it can exacerbate because it batters our immune system and it leaves us depleted, which leaves us vulnerable to infection. Other symptoms, I'm just going to go through these really quickly. Nausea, loss of appetite. Some people binge eat, toothaches. I ended up with a horrific toothache, and it was because I was clenching my jaw because I was so stressed. I lost my appetite. I lost 5 kilos in that first week. And I was actually eating. I was forcing myself to focus on superfoods, but the shock just hit my system, and my system wasn't even processing the food properly. I had digestive issues. I had the whole lot going on. It was horrendous, let me tell you. It affects our sleep, depression, anxiety, a sense of loneliness, especially if you already feel lonely. It just exacerbates these things. Emotional overwhelm, suicidal thoughts. Let me tell you, suicidal thoughts are not uncommon. In a deep loss, especially if it's sudden, that early stage of acute loss when you're just shocked and numb. And the thing about these suicidal thoughts for a griever in early loss, very common, it's not necessarily that the person wants to die. It's that seeing a future ahead and a pathway on a trajectory that you don't want, sometimes it's just, I don't know how to live. Like it's too hard to live. It's not that I necessarily wanted to die. I had these thoughts. And yeah, it's like, how can I possibly live my life without my son? How is that even possible? And so this is where, it's not uncommon. And so holding that space, allowing the people processing these thoughts, these feelings, these emotions, this overwhelm is really important. It's why people need support. It's why people need help. Now, grief can show up in so many different ways. It can show up as trauma. It can show up as grief, anger, despair. It can be just shock, numbness, sadness, depression. Some people can feel relief, inspiration, and you can feel all those things at different times. I felt all those things. And it's a little bit like a pendulum swinging. You can be one thing 1 minute, something else the next. There's no right or wrong. You can bounce around. You can be all over the place. And you know what? That's normal. You're doing it right. You're not doing it wrong. It's actually normal to feel this whole gamut of different emotions. And the other thing that I really want to emphasize is that it's not a linear process. It's not tidy. It's messy. And it's all over the place. And that too is very, very normal. One of the ways I heard it described earlier on in my grief was like a roller coaster. And I really, for me, it felt like a roller coaster. It was kind of like up, 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 and then whoom, down into the depths, and then whoa, blindsided over here, and then back over there. And it was all over the place, just hard, 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 whichever way I turned. So I really liked that metaphor of the roller coaster as well, because it's a really good way of describing just how messy it can be. Now, as I said before, every trauma has grief, but not every grief has trauma. And I want to dive into this a little bit. So, when is grief traumatic? When is grief traumatic? Does anyone want to have a go in the chat box? When is grief traumatic? Sudden and unexpected. Yep, exactly. Yes. Yes, blindsided. Absolutely. And blindsided, especially with betrayal, relationships, that sort of stuff, work changes, violent, 100%. Yes, yes. So you're all spot on. It is the suddenness, it's the unexpectedness. When it comes to death, it's deaths that are outside the normal, what's considered the normal range of life. If someone died at 60, that can be considered early. Certainly, my son, 18, car accident. So accidents, overdoses, suicide. These are all traumatic losses. Homicides. Now, if you're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, panic attacks, anxiety, flashing images or just absolutely disconnected, I just want you all to understand that healing is totally possible. We just have to connect you back in with your nervous system, connect you back in with the inner self, and pull the pieces back in. It's like actually, I've got a good slide on this. I was going to start explaining it, but I've got a slide. So trauma, this is how I like to explain trauma. I try to keep my language very practical and easy rather than jargon-like. But to me, trauma is a heightened emotional response. It's too big. It's beyond what we can tolerate. And that trauma can originate from a single event. It can originate from a series of events, or it could be a prolonged or enduring situation. And when I say prolonged or enduring situation, sometimes, especially as children, trauma can be a response to what didn't happen but should have. For example, we may have had a parent that wasn't emotionally available to us. That can create trauma in a child. Neglect. People living in, someone mentioned violence before, anyone living in a toxic environment or situation, especially long term, it's not possible to be on that. It's not sustainable to be in that fragile eggshell situation and be at that high intensity of feeling for a long time. And what happens is typically people will start to have the panic attacks or the anxiety, or they'll just collapse and shut down and totally disconnect. So it can go either way. Now, trauma is it's not the event, it's not what happens to us, it's how we respond to that event. It's what happens inside of us. And this grief and trauma work, it's ongoing. It's not just a couple of days or one session, or it's not a week. It's something that will continually come up. And that's why having tools in your toolkit, knowing how to feel, knowing how to connect with yourself is really, really powerful. It is the best way that we can help anybody in grief, is to teach them to connect with themselves. Now, grief and trauma become very entangled. They're kind of interconnected in many ways. And I know for me, I did a course with David Kessler and Frank Anderson. It was called The Connection Between Grief and Trauma. And I learned through doing that program that the grief is the loss. The grief is the I miss you. It's the longing. It's the sadness. It's the loss. Whereas the trauma is the heightened emotional response. It's the triggers. It's the sudden flashbacks and visuals. For me, and I hope I don't trigger people talking too much about my story, but when I hear a car tire screeching, boom, I'm back at the accident. That's trauma. That's not grief. When I drive past something, and sometimes it comes up and I just really miss Aaron. I call them love bubbles. That's the loss. That's the grief. But the trauma is watching the TV and all of a sudden there's a body going in the crematorium, or there's a car accident on TV. Boom, I'm straight back into the trauma. That's the trauma. That's not grief. So they are a bit different. We process them in the same way, connecting with the body. So trauma, just so I'm clear, it's the flashbacks, it's the visions, it's the imagery, it's the flooding, it's the all too much. It's when you're kind of all of a sudden you're just thrown into it and you're back there like it was yesterday. That's trauma. Grief is I miss you, I love you, I'm sad you're not here. I wish you were here. So I've put this slide together to try to describe trauma in our body, what happens. And it's a really, really powerful visual representation of trauma. We have a window of tolerance. And when we're within our window of tolerance, that's the yellow line there in the middle, see in between the dotted lines, we're socially engaged, we can connect, we're grounded, we're flexible, we can be open, we can be curious, we have energy. We can look people in the eyes. We don't have to hide away at home because it's all too much. We are present and we are able to emotionally self-regulate. What happens once something goes beyond our window of tolerance, and everyone's window of tolerance is different. You can have 4 siblings and a parent dies, and one sibling will go into trauma and the other 3 are like, what's the drama? We knew they were going. Like, everyone will handle it differently. So it depends on every person's individual window of tolerance. It's the experiences that they've had. It's how they've learned how to process their emotions, how they connect, what's been missing in their life, what they've experienced. There's so many different factors. Every single relationship is different. That sibling would have had a different relationship with their parent or a different attachment to their parent than the other siblings. So when it goes beyond our window of tolerance, we can go one of 2 ways: up into what I call hyperarousal or down into hypoarousal. When we go up into hyperarousal, that's fast. It's the high energy, it's the hypervigilance, it's the anxiety, that fight, flight, survival response. People get angry up there. It's very chaotic and overwhelmed. So they're sort of typical characteristics of going up into hyperarousal. The other way is hypoarousal. Now, when we go into hypoarousal, this is where we shut down. So if someone, I work with people and they'll say, I had a mental breakdown. Well, what's probably happened is they went into hyperarousal and jumped down into hypoarousal where they just couldn't get out of bed. Shut down. The body shuts down. It's all too much. I'm not doing this. The body is going into survival because it's not possible to stay in hyperarousal. So numb, freeze, depression, the shame, it can be very passive, very withdrawn down there. Now, as I said, window of tolerance, we're engaged, we're connected, we can self-regulate. What happens? And that's engaging the ventral vagal system, for those of you that know that terminology. When we go up into hyperarousal, we're mobilized, it's active, it's fast, fight, flight, versus the freeze. So when we're mobilized, this is where we're engaging the sympathetic mode. There's a sense of threat. Down the bottom, we become demobilized. So when we're in this hypoarousal, we need to sit with that. And that's where the parasympathetic system, the dorsal vagal, so the collapse helpless comes in. So I trust that's useful. When I saw that, loved it. If you want to take a photo, now's a good time. That's all the bits for that one. Okay, got that? All right, now I'd like to switch and talk about the grief timeline, because when we talk about the grief timeline, there is this sense out there, or this concept that time is probably, that time heals all wounds. Time heals all wounds. But this concept that time heals all wounds, it's probably responsible for more heartache than any other single wrong idea in our society. This is from the Grief Recovery Handbook. And when I read this, I'm just like, boom. The concept that time heals is responsible for more heartache than any other single wrong idea in our society. And the terrible part is it's actually not true. And the reason why it's not true is because time doesn't heal. It's what we do with that time that heals. It's our response. When it comes to grief, people will say, how long will I grieve? The expectation, 6 months and she'll be right. I'll just let her hibernate for 6 months, and then we need to be out. Then we need to be doing stuff again. And, and people can judge you if you're not getting through your grief quickly enough. Let me tell you, there is no time that I will never miss my son. There was no time that I will never grieve. My son will always be gone. And for those of you in grief, your person, the thing that you're in grief for, is gone. Aaron's not coming back. Your person is not coming back. So therefore, a part of you will always hold some grief. But the grief can change over time, especially if you do the work. Now, the reason there's no timeline in grief is because we're all unique and we all grieve differently. And you will have seen this. People grieve differently. There's no one map. No two people will experience grief in the same way. So therefore, what I want to share with you is a couple of different tools that I use to help with timing. There are what we call stages of grief. So there is a stage called anticipatory grief, and this is the grief that happens before the death. The grief that happens before the death. That's what I call anticipatory grief. Then when our loved one dies, what happens is we move into this acute phase. And the acute phase is when it just happens. And that acute phase can last anywhere from a month, 3 months, a year, 2 years. It's different for everybody. But it's really that time when it's pure survival. It's pure survival. That's acute grief. The acute grief is when you're in the depths of the pain, when the pain is the worst, when it feels like there's no bottom and no end. It's just ongoing. Then over time, we move into what we call early grief. So this can typically it's the first 2 years. In many ways, I'm coming up to 3.5 years. It still feels early for me. Still feels early. I had a moment just at 4:30 this afternoon and it felt like I still can't believe he's not here. And I had to have a moment. And, you know, it still comes up. But what does happen is the grief starts to mature. And I feel like I'm definitely in mature grief. And I remember at 2 years, it felt quite mature then. It changed. It's subtle, but it changes. Where the grief is not so painful. It's there, it's constant, but it's not pulling me down. It's not throwing me on the roller coaster. It's not as hard to cope with and deal with as it was before, because I've developed these tools and learnt to sort of lean into it. So please understand that the grief is going to change. It's not necessarily going to follow a timeline. And as it moves, as it grows, it will mature. And it is going to be different for everyone. The intensity, the frequency of the triggers will lessen. Or people can get stuck in it. Now, for those of you working with grievers, these stages are important, because if someone comes to me and they're really stuck and it's been 3 years and they can't go to the shops or go out and see somebody, it's time for intervention. But if it was the first 3 months, I'd be like, knock yourself out. You just do whatever you need to do. So that's where the timing matters from a professional perspective, is to help you gauge those interventions. For me, the mature grief, I like when it comes up now and I feel the loss, I often will feel love. And so it's like the journey is through the pain towards the love, because grief is love. It's reconnecting with that love. So as it comes up, I said before, I call it love bubbles now. I'll just have a love bubble. And I just think it's just a nice way to where I just miss Aaron. And so I'll just sit in that energy. Now, I want to share the Tompkins model of grief with you, because I really liked this. I did a course with Monash, and that's actually where I met some of the Red Nose team. I did this course, and they talked about this Tompkins model of grief, where the size of our grief doesn't change over time, but we grow our lives around our grief. You know, time doesn't heal. It's what we do with the time. And this is a really good way to demonstrate that, how we build our life around our loss. And so I want you to imagine this early acute phase of grief, where the acute grief in the beginning, it's just everything. And so your grief is this wishing well, and the emotions are the water in the well. So the emotions is all the water, all the churning inside the well, and you are absolutely consumed. You can't see anything beyond the well. The grief is everything, and it's all consuming. That's acute grief. When we move into this next stage, over time, what happens in early grief, we begin to learn to pull up the bucket and water the garden. We begin to learn to tend to our emotions we begin to learn pulling up the bucket and emptying it out, learning how to express, learning how to feel, healthy ways to feel, how to express ourselves, how to cope, how to ask for what we need. We're basically emptying that bucket. And if we're doing it in a healthy way, we're watering the garden around us, we're tending to our loss. Then as we move into this mature grief, if we're tending our grief in healthy ways, I've got to emphasize this because there's many ways to tend to our grief, and many of them are not healthy. Many people numb and avoid their pain. They'll start drinking or taking drugs or anti-anxiety, antidepressants. You know, there's so many different ways to numb and avoid your pain and not deal with it and disconnect with it. So eventually, if we're processing our grief and our loss in healthy ways, we're watering the garden around us. Our life grows around our loss. It's a beautiful way to visualize the journey. But I want to be clear. See that wishing well in the middle? Hasn't changed size. It's still the same size, but our life around our loss has grown. We've built our life around our loss. Our grief is still there. And so we just keep going. You can totally build a beautiful life around your loss and bring your loved one on the journey with you. Now, if we're not tending to the garden, if we're not processing our emotions, what happens is our world gets small and we stay stuck in a world where we're not. Some people just lose their desire to live altogether. Some people just become so secluded and so lost and so stuck and so much in guilt and shame and the what ifs, the shoulda, the coulda, the woulda, the if only, all the stories and the mental suffering. And I want to be clear. Pain is inevitable in grief, and you might want to write this down. Pain is inevitable in grief, but suffering is not. Suffering is optional. Pain is inevitable in grief, but suffering is not. And suffering is the stories, the guilt, the shame, the what if, the if onlys, the shoulda, the coulda, the woulda. A large proportion of grief support work is dealing with people's guilt and stories. Now, once again, in the early stages of grief and loss, those first 6 months or whatever, I don't like to put time frames on it, but for me, it was about 6 months. My mind had to totally recalibrate. And it has to go through those stories and it has to go through the what ifs. And I have to try to process all that. But there comes a point where you begin to hang on to those stories and they become your reality and they're not even necessarily true. I was telling myself if I had have had water in the spa, Aaron wouldn't have gone driving at 4 a.m. He would have gone in the spa. I was taking on responsibility that wasn't mine. Another story I was telling myself, I was away at a festival when this happened. If I had been at home, he wouldn't have gone out driving in the middle of the night. Now, David Kessler worked with me on my grief stories in front of like 900 practitioners worldwide, and I'm there blubbering and crying, but it was powerful. And he said, so Christy, so does that mean if you're at home, 18-year-old boys don't go out driving at 4 a.m.? He really, really pushed me. Does that mean if people have water in their spa, boys don't drive at 4 a.m.? Like, it's not true. There's stories. But for me, it was my way because the grief was too much. So for me, I was going into the stories whenever the grief came up. I'd go into the what ifs, and it was my escape from feeling the loss. I wasn't ready to accept, and I had to start working on accepting he was gone. Which wasn't easy. So that's the Tompkins model of grief. The size of our grief doesn't change over time. What happens is we grow our lives around our grief. That's the goal. That's the bottom line. Now, I want to share some tips on dealing with the acute and early stages of grief. Please understand that grief needs space to breathe. So this is about engaging in your grief. Grief needs to be witnessed. That's why joining support groups are powerful. That's why coming to a masterclass like this matters. Talking about your grief makes a difference. Doing grief work, doing grief activities, getting a grief coach, a healer helps. Your grief does need to be witnessed. Having grief is witnessed, having your pain witnessed without someone trying to fix you because you're not broken. Grief is a normal response to loss. You don't want to be a victim to it. You need to engage it. I call it, I like to wrestle with it. I'll wrestle with it. So, be a courageous griever. Give it some space. So these tips, I'm going to shoot through these pretty quickly. If anyone wants a photo of this slide is going to go up to number 9 before I move on. Okay, just so you know. So the first tip is accept and ask for help. Drop-offs, pickups, groceries. I'm talking about the early stages, first couple of months. Cleaning, delegate whatever you can, because grief is exhausting. It is one of the heaviest emotions we can carry in the body. It can be a struggle to get out of bed. If it's a struggle to get out of bed, you just get up, brush your teeth, go back to bed. When you're looking after yourself and you celebrate the fact that you got up and brushed your teeth, that's enough. So accepting and asking for help, really, really important. You could just have someone come and sit with you. I don't want you to talk. I just want company. I don't want to be alone. It doesn't matter. That can show up anyway. Secondly, now some of these tips sound very basic, but let me tell you, drinking lots of water, tears and shock dehydrate you. And when you are in early acute grief, I couldn't remember to drink. I actually couldn't remember to drink. I was so dehydrated. My daughter was the same. We were so dehydrated, and that led to other issues. So it's actually really important. It's one of the first things I say to people, anyone, make sure they're drinking lots of water. I actually got my daughter's friends to send us Snapchat and photos of them drinking water and bottles and things like that, just at random times throughout the day, because I'd get a Snapchat and it was like, oh, yes, I have to drink, because I couldn't think for myself. My brain was just in fog. So drink lots of water, eat healthy foods. Once again, it sounds very simple, but when your body is in the deep throes of grief, some people will overeat, some people will undereat. It's very, very common. And so any type of eating, it needs to be focused on healthy power foods because you need your energy. It's exhausting. Having healthy boundaries with visitors is really important. We live in this people-pleasing society. If someone messages us, we feel we need to message back. If someone rings us, we feel we need to return the call. And we put so much pressure on ourselves. I had a girlfriend whose 13-year-old daughter, Lucia, she died 3 weeks after Aaron. She had an epileptic seizure in her sleep. And so we kind of were on this journey together, and she had people showing up at her door unannounced, grieving, and she was supporting them. Like, what the? So having boundaries around grief. I didn't have that because I don't know if you caught that date. Aaron died on the 14th of March, 2020. It was the weekend Melbourne went into lockdown. So, I didn't get many visitors and that sort of thing, but I did get the amount of texts and messages and phone calls from people I hadn't heard from for 10 years were coming through, and I just let it all go. And I just chose a select few people, and she's one of them. Angie's here. Hello. I had a few select people, about 3 or 4 people who I chose to connect with, and that's all I had the energy for. And so having boundaries being, no is a complete sentence. Write that down. No is a complete sentence. You only see people who are helping you. So this is about reducing all the noise, because trust me, you need every ounce of energy that you can muster to get through the day. And I'm not exaggerating. You need every ounce of energy that you can muster. So don't waste it unnecessarily. Other thing is, especially if it's traumatic, is to focus on micro moments. I had to do this a lot because it was too much because I was up in that hypervigilant state. It was just I was everywhere, and it was too much. Even breathing. I've got a video on my YouTube channel called How Grief Honestly Feels. I don't know. I recommend you all watch that, because I asked people who were deeply grieving, and most of the people that answered were parents who had lost children. How would you explain your grief to someone who has no idea? And so I got all these beautiful metaphors and experiences, true experiences, and I got photos of their children. And so we've honoured the children in that video and shared how these parents felt. And one thing that was very common theme through them all, it was actually hard to breathe. And I find it's interesting, whenever I do this presentation, my breath goes shallow. I feel it. So it's very, very hard to breathe. And so just breathing, focusing on micro moments is, and some of you pop in the chat box how you would do that. Just share some examples. I'll share some as well. But for me, it was, I just would go out the back door and smell the grass. Like simple. Look at a flower, watch a bee in the flower, feel the breeze on my cheek, or focus, shut my eyes and just feel the sun. So, walking in nature is incredibly powerful. Going to the beach. I remember just walking out into the water, and anytime I did something that made me feel alive, it triggered my loss. Riding my bike, go swimming in the water, and I just would melt down. And so I remember walking out into the ocean with my back to everybody and just looking at the sky and just like, oh my God, just being in that moment and just letting the emotion feel. So being in nature, it grounds you. It reminds you that you're alive when you're in nature. Yeah, listening to birds, watching the sky. Perfect. Exactly. You've got it. That's what I'm talking about. Water. Yeah, water's beautiful. So that's what I mean when I say focus on micro moments, because especially in trauma, you need to ground yourself. When you're going off and it's flooding and there's visuals and that sort of thing, it's like, oh, this is a mouse. This pen is white. Like, keep it simple. I'm wearing red glasses. So grounding yourself in the moment is a similar thing to focusing on micro moments, a similar strategy. Another thing that we can do, here's my thing, there we go, is move our bodies. Once again, it sounds very simple, but as I've said many times, and I'll continue to say it, grief's heavy. Moving's really, really hard. I forced myself, I think it was about week 3, and I felt so sluggish, and I forced myself to go riding on my bike, and I knew it would trigger my grief because every time I got on the bike, I felt alive. Boom. So I put on my sunglasses and off I went. I forced myself to go. It was the best thing I did because it took the pressure away from my heart, and it allowed me to breathe. And I felt so much better afterwards. It was hard to do, but sometimes you've just got to do this stuff anyway, even if you don't want to, especially if you don't want to. Also, reaching out for support. Reaching out for support. So when it comes to reaching out for support, talking to people who understand grief is powerful, especially if they've had a similar loss. I regularly receive calls from people who are bereaved, newly bereaved, 40 years ago, it doesn't matter, people I don't know. And I mean, I offer free discovery calls, not to sign everyone up for coaching, but some people just need a conversation, they need someone to talk to, and they need to be pointed towards resources. So it can actually really help to talk to someone who has some knowledge in the area, but also someone who actually understands grief. Because they'll say, I feel da-da-da. It's like, of course. I'm not trying to fix them. Everything they feel is normal. Everything we feel is there for a reason. Sometimes we need to unpack, and it's a little bit complex of working that out and why, but no one has to pretend they're okay when you're with someone who understands grief. They don't need the mask, and that's why it's really, really important. It's also really powerful to join grief support networks and groups. And now that's going to look differently for everybody, and it is important to look around. It's like if you're looking around for a therapist, do your homework. Somatic style therapy is probably the best for when it comes to grief, because it works with the body, it works with the mind, it works with the heart, it works with all the different aspects. When you join a grief support group, typically most grief support groups out there, they really just focus on letting you speak about your grief and having your pain witnessed. There's no grief education or tangible activities and stuff like that you can work on. David Kessler's grief support group that I moderate in Tender Hearts, it's very affordable. It's online. He has activities that you work on. He works with people one-to-one. He has a whole heap of different ways of working with the grief, but he's actively engaging. And then when you see him working with others, that helps you also, because you'll relate. A lot of what we experience is not dissimilar. So, look around, see what's out there. There's so much opportunity. And the other thing is to make sure that if you're getting professional support, that they're grief informed. I cannot tell you how many people have come to me with grief, or they're dealing with trauma or whatever they're dealing with. Often my clients are just stuck. They're stuck in a rut and they don't know how to move again. But usually there's grief. Oh, Dad died 10 years ago. Did you get any professional support? Yes. Did it help? No. I had one lady that I was working with recently. She's 26 and her father passed when she was 16. And she went and saw a counsellor, and the counsellor told her she just had to get over it. Now, I hear that all the time. It's very common. That is someone who they're not grief experienced. They don't understand grief, because anybody that understood the grief journey would never say that. And so what happens is, if you're working with a counsellor or a therapist or someone, and remember, I train practitioners worldwide. I'm the global trainer of self-directed healing practitioners. The amount of practitioners, even psychiatrists, psychologists will come through the training and they will say they're not taught how to feel emotion through the body. They're taught how to prescribe, how to cognitively work with the mental, with the thoughts, with this sort of stuff, rewiring the brain, a lot of talk therapy, and that can be beneficial. But if you're not moving the emotion in your body, your head can tell you one thing and the heart can be telling you a completely different story. And so that's why it's important. And not just grief informed. You want a grief authority. You want a grief expert. You want someone who really gets it. And just to really drive this point home, now, you wouldn't go to a podiatrist if you wanted to fix your sore tooth, would you? It's the same thing when it comes to therapy. People will have their specialty. They'll have their niche. They'll have what they're good at. And it's like any doctor, any therapist that you go to, you're going to get good ones and you're going to get bad ones. So shop around, ask for referrals, do your homework. I spent 3 days looking for someone to work with. And I spoke on the phone and I'm like, okay, well, that wasn't quite right. Is there anyone you can refer me to? Who else do you know? And I just kept going until I found Anna. I found my Anna. And it was worth it, because you know what? My life is important and my grief was important. And I needed to have somebody who was experienced and qualified enough that could hold my hand and take me on the journey. And she did that. So get the right support. Now, the last tip 10, is you feel what you need to feel. So this is practicing healthy ways to connect with your emotions. So learning how to let your body express itself. Learning to ride the waves of that emotion. Now, I just want to spend a moment on this. I don't have much time to go. There's so much I want to share, and I just don't have the time in this masterclass today. But I feel it's important to talk about multiple losses, because they're a little bit different when we're dealing with loss and when we're dealing with grief. Because what happens with multiple losses is our minds go into over here and then over here and then over here. It's a bit like, that game Whack-A-Mole, where the moles pop up and you whack them when they pop up. That's what multiple. Do you know the game I'm talking about? It's a bit like Whack-A-Mole. Bang, bang, bang. What about Mary? What about Mum? What about Ted? when you go into the grief, what happens is you'll be sitting with one loss and then the other one comes in and then the other one comes in. And so it can be all over the place. Now, when it comes to healing from loss, sometimes when you're supporting a griever who has multiple losses, or if that's yourself, sometimes we can just witness them being all over the place. But I will actually say to them, I can witness your grief being all over the place, or we can focus on one loss and do some healing. What would you prefer? And then which loss are we going to be focusing on today? We're going to be focusing on mum. Okay. So do I have your permission, if Mary comes in, if Ted comes in, to just ask them to wait for now? We're just with mum. Yes. And so you get permission, and then you can just pull them back. So you focus on one at a time. And it's a little bit like dating. If you're meeting up with a friend, you're not on the phone talking to everybody else. You're with your friend. So it's the same thing. And if, you've got somebody over and then Ted comes knocking on the door, so you're sitting with your grief with your mum, Ted's knocking at the door. It's, oh, hey, honey, I'm just with mum at the moment. Can I come to you next week? And so you just give each loss its own individual time. And it can be 10 seconds. It can be an hour. It could be cook a meal. It could be visit a special place. It could be play some music and have a dance. It can, it doesn't have to be a long, big thing. But if you just focus on one at a time and come back to the others, you give them all their individual space, you will eventually begin to heal. I trust that's useful. So it is one area. I'm not a fan of compartmentalization, but it's a little bit like that. Boxes. You bring the box out, you work with that, put the box back. Okay, next box. Little bit like that, one at a time. Now, when it comes to supporting people in grief, now, often what happens is grief makes people uncomfortable. We're not in a society that's learnt to feel emotional pain. And the reason it gets uncomfortable is because we don't understand grief. We haven't been taught these skills, and it's outside of our comfort zone. So now, as I switch into this supporting people with grief, I want to talk to you from that perspective. So not the griever, it's supporting the griever. We are living in a grief illiterate world. I honestly believe that. It's one of the reasons why I run this training. It's one of the reasons why I don't charge for it, because I feel it's really important for people to understand this. It's a skill we haven't been taught. And so we tend to avoid what's outside our comfort zone. Now, when it comes to grief support is about meeting people where they are. It's about listening, being comfortable sitting in the silence. And the reason I've written there's power in the pause is because people would say to me, how are you? And my mind would go into pieces. I don't know. Like, I don't know. How do I even articulate that? And my mind would be like trying to, how am I? And then you know what? The conversation's moved on. So stop. You don't have to speak. You've got to give the grief some space, and you've got to give them time to process their thinking and their thoughts. So there really is a lot of power in the pause. So get comfortable with the silence. It's so powerful. And I learned, I learned that some people were not comfortable with me, with the silence. They'd ask me, but they weren't really, it was like they didn't care enough to wait. That's what it felt like. I felt invalidated because the conversation would go on. I'm like, hang on a minute. I haven't even told you how I am. So it's tricky. Now, supporting people in grief is all about witnessing their pain. Meet their eyes. See them. It's okay. It's how we connect. It creates emotional connection when we connect with someone and show our pain and see our pain. The best thing that you can say to a griever is, how are you feeling today? You need to write that down. How are you feeling today? Because let me tell you, every day is different. You can be fine one day and then a week later you're in a basket case, terrible state. And then you might be all right for another week and then boom, down again. So how are you feeling today is really, really powerful. And not just in grief, I think it's just better than how are you? But ask yourself as well, how can I sit with them? How can I sit with them? How can I be that one person who's making them feel they're doing it right? It's a nice way to think of it, isn't it? Even if you feel they're not doing it right, you've got to create enough safe space for them to be able to feel vulnerable enough to begin healing the journey with you. Now, you don't have to have the right thing to say. You don't have to know what to say. You can say, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I have no words. I don't know what to say. I love that. You don't need to fix anything. You don't need answers. You don't need solutions. They're not broken. They are simply grieving. So they are responding perfectly naturally to a deep loss. So show you care enough to have the conversation as well. A lot of people will fear bringing up their loved one's name for fear of re-triggering them. It's like, oh, I don't want to re-trigger them. Well, let me tell you, if you think they've forgotten for one moment, you're crazy. They have not forgotten, I assure you. If you knew their person, share stories, say what you miss, make it real. If they don't want to talk about it, that's them avoiding their pain. And that's their right. But normalize the conversation. Many grievers fear that their loved one will be forgotten. Very common. I've felt that. But I reassure someone. So if you're working with a griever, I just say, that's not possible. There will never come a time when you'll forget or they'll be forgotten. They mattered. And so that's a really nice thing to say if they feel like they'll be forgotten. You just got to remind them they're not going to be forgotten. It's about creating rituals and traditions and ways to connect with them moving forward. When I'm working with someone, I'll often ask, they'll say, oh, my partner died or dad or someone died. And I'll just say, oh, my brother, what's their name? It's Andrew. Okay. Can you tell me something that you love about Andrew? And that's nice because it shows you're willing to have the conversation and it gives them some space to connect with that love, and their face normally lights up. It's really quite special. So what was their name? Tell me something you love about them. That's quite nice as well. Now, if any of you are supporting a dying person or you have clients or you're working with people who are supporting someone who's dying, you've really got to remember self-care because you've got to put on your own oxygen mask first. Because it depletes your energy. Once again, when you're supporting someone who's dying, it takes so much energy. And so if you're not filling up your cup, you will burn out and then you're useless. It's not sustainable if you're not doing your own self-care. So you've got to actually prioritize doing nice things for yourself. Even if you haven't got time, especially if you haven't got time, you have to find a way. So you've got to support yourself so you can support others because it's not sustainable to just be giving. You will burn out. Now, when it comes to processing deep emotions, we are living in a society that has learnt to numb and avoid our pain. We don't know how to process our emotions. Australia has the second highest rate in the world for prescribing antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. Second highest rate in the world. It's ridiculous. And making an absolute mock out of grief and trauma. Instead of getting people to learn how to feel and process emotions, right? Now, don't get me wrong. There are absolutely times when it is necessary for medication. Medication may be necessary to be able to get someone to be able to do some therapy or do some healing. That might be needed. but it shouldn't be the go-to. I know I could have gone to a doctor and I would have been prescribed medication because that's the model of the world that we live in. But I also knew enough to know that I didn't need, I'd done enough work to know I didn't need that. I just needed to learn how to feel. Emotions, when it's trapped in our body, it contributes to, the data is showing 75 to 90% of disease. Trapped emotions, trapped stress in our body leads to disease. That emotional energy becomes heavy. And the heaviness creates the moods. The heaviness creates the anxiety, the depression, the overwhelm, the burnout, the stress. Because if we don't process the emotion, it turns into a mood, it gets heavier. The weight in the body creates the stress and the heaviness, and it leads to physical pain. You know, you think about it. This society, we're living in a society that's learnt to numb and avoid. Boys don't cry. You're too emotional. Anger and sadness is regarded as negative. People don't want to feel angry. They don't want to feel sad. They're unwelcome emotions. People push them away, but they're actually very healthy emotions. If we know how to process them in healthy ways, they are there for a reason. And it comes down to how we actually express them. Too many people will just go to addictions to numb their pain. The addiction's the symptom of the problem. It's not the problem. The problem is why they're taking whatever they're taking. The addiction is the symptom. The reason they're addicted to something, that's the problem. And so as healers, as therapists, that's what we have to find. Even things like toxic positivity, bright-siding, you know, spiritual bypassing, these are all clever strategies that people have to feel calmer in the moment. Gratitude, positive affirmations, meditation. And once again, please don't get me wrong, there is absolute benefit to these practices. But if people are doing them to numb and avoid their pain, they're not healing. They're numbing and avoiding their pain. So we need to be very clear about those practices. Good tools in the toolkit for self-moderation, but not necessarily healing unless you're going in and doing the deeper work. So that emotional pain, it does get trapped in our body. It does lead to disease. So this is always about exploring and finding those healthy ways. Now, I have learnt to embrace the pain of loss. For me, I try not to fight it. When I feel it coming up in my body, I lean in and I allow it. If I don't, it just causes more friction in my body because it's heavy, literally. And so we need to learn how to listen because our bodies talk to us. So the question is are you listening when your body talks to you? I said this just before, emotions are fleeting in nature. But if we don't process, because they come, they go. That's the nature of emotions. They come, they go. If we don't process them, they turn into moods. And moods is the overwhelm, the stress, the guilt, the shame, the depression, the anxiety, the addictions. It's like waves. We've got to learn to ride those waves all the way to the shore. I ride it. I stay on that wave as long as I can. It's like, you know, if you have 300 tears to cry, don't stop at 250. You got to get it all out. You've got to ride that wave all the way. So sit with it, ride it, and just go with it. Get it all out. Now, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to talk very briefly about my business and answer some of those questions. And then just for a couple minutes, and then I'm going to switch into the group healing. Okay. So when I talk about, you know, creating change in the work that I do, it's so much more than grief and trauma, because I believe that it's our job to connect with our best self, to connect with our potential. It's like what we're here for. We are here to live our best life. It's why we're here. It's to live well and to live our best life. And so I'm really passionate about supporting people who are navigating their grief journey, clearly. But the work I do is so much more than that. So that core focus is living our best life despite the challenges that life can throw at us. So how can we tap into that potential to get the success, to get the results that we really, desire, that we deserve, that we want. And so how I work, I'm a little bit like a GP when it comes to coaching and healing. I'm very holistic in my approach, in so much that, you know, we have work, we have our careers, we have our relationships, we have our sexuality, we have our hobbies and our interests and our health and our well-being. We have all these different aspects of our being, and I sort of tap and dabble into all those different areas and go where we need to go. So from a coaching perspective, as a life and results coach, it's very forward focused, very action orientated. That's really about getting clarity around your direction, clarity around your purpose. And there's a lot of actions in there. But the stuff that keeps us stuck, that's where the healer comes in. So that's the grief, the trauma, the anger, the anxiety. I work with a lot of suicidal clients, work with those limiting beliefs. The stuff, it's like, what are your dreams and aspirations? Where are you now? What are the steps you need to take to get there? And then why aren't you there already? What's the stuff that's keeping you stuck? The self-sabotage and all the stuff, I call it the sludge that's in there. So I am the healer, and I'm also an educator. So I'm a grief educator. I run the self-directed healing practitioner training worldwide. I run workshops, masterclasses. I have programs, and I have a YouTube channel that's got a number of videos on it as well. So there's 3 different ways to work with me. I have the one-to-one membership. That is where I meet with my clients every week, and it's an ongoing relationship for a minimum of 3 months. These are for people who want to up-level their life. They want to get some traction. If you're really trying to process some deep emotional stuff, or you're a high achiever trying to up-level, anything like that, that's a really good match, the one-to-one membership. I also offer coaching and healing super sessions. So these are 2-hour sessions if you've got one particular thing that you need to focus on. So that could be goal setting. It could be managing your time. It could be emotional healing. It could be working on boundaries and relationships, anything like that. You can book me just for a one-off super session. And then I have a range of workshops as well, which I will cover in a sec. So I work with a variety of clients. I attract 2 types of clients typically. I work with a lot of leaders and business owners because of my organizational and leadership background. I work with a lot of high achievers. But then I also work with people who are just drowning, struggling in life, and they just want to get their head above the water. So I kind of work with both because I go into that deeper stuff. Now, the workshops that I run my workshops online, and I also offer face-to-face workshops as well. And this is just some of them. So I run a How to Master Your Time. So it's Master Your Time to Master Your Life. All my workshops are strongly underpinned by life coaching principles and healing principles. So they're well-being workshops, and they can be run in corporates. They can be run for community groups, for network groups. Crucial Conversations is all about how we communicate, why communication breaks down, and how to get it back on track. So it's how to have difficult conversations. Work-life balance looks at all the different areas in your life and how you can get balance across those different areas. I have the Living with Grief and Trauma workshop, which you're at right now. I also run an emotional balance workshop that talks individually about our different primary emotions and how to process them. And I run workshops around fatigue, leadership fatigue, and fatigue in the workplace as well. So I do have a QR code that gives you access to resources. I have a lot of free resources on my website. So you can scan that code. I've got some links that I will pop in the chat box for you. Hang on, just bear with me. I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen to do that. I'll do that in a sec. I will pop this QR code up in a moment. The other thing I have on my website is a free Living with Grief ebook. So you might want to go on and download that. And I have the YouTube channel that I've mentioned. So there's a number of grief videos on there. Now, Christy Roberts Coaching is my tag. That's how you'll find me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And anyone can book a free discovery call. So if you're sitting there, especially if you work with people who are really struggling, or anyone who you feel in your life would benefit from my services, just get them to book in for a free discovery call. And I'd also encourage you, if you're interested in having more conversations about how we could work together, book in for a call. Happy to have that conversation. I'm not a big salesy person, really genuinely here to help. So you will absolutely get benefit out of that call. So that's a really good way just to continue the conversation and just to see if we're a match to do some work together. So I want to talk very briefly about self-directed healing, and then we're going to go into our group session. How are we going? Yeah, good for time. Okay, so self-directed healing, it's revolutionary. It's a fast healing modality that works with this really deep emotional pain. In my grief, it was so intense. I was getting chest pain. My heart physically hurt. It was excruciatingly painful. The pain spread into my throat. I began coughing. Like I actually thought I was getting COVID and wouldn't be able to go to Aaron's funeral. It was hectic. And I discovered self-directed healing, believe it or not, the synchronicity of life. I met the founder of self-directed healing the day before Aaron died. Go figure. And it was the only thing that I could imagine could help me. I knew I needed help, but I knew a psychologist wasn't going to be enough. And so I did this healing session. I kid you not, that the energy that left my body, it was miraculous. So it releases these deep emotional pains energetically through the physical body. Now, it works on every layer of our emotional, physical being. It works emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, energetically, consciously, unconsciously, and superconsciously. It's why it's so effective. Now, I don't have time to go into a lot of details around this, but suffice it to say, for me now, I have two superpowers. My first one is Aaron. My love for Aaron drives me to change society, to change grief literacy around the world. It's a key driver for me. And my other superpower is self-directed healing. I quite literally would not be where I am today in this healthy state without it. It's been an absolute game changer. So we're going to go through. We're going to change the tempo. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. While I do that, I am going to grab those links for you. And pop them in the chat. We're going to do our healing. And then what I'm going to do, the healing's going to take about 10, probably 15 minutes. So we're going to go slightly over. And where's my chat gone? Hang on, bear with me. And then I'm happy. I will stay on as long as you like for me to answer any questions that you have. So I can see a lot of you have your cameras off at the moment. So if you're there, I would invite you to turn your camera on for the healing, because I need to be able to see you so that I can gauge the energy and where you're at. You'll all be on silent. Everyone will have their eyes closed, so don't worry about feeling self-conscious, because you'll all have your eyes closed as we go through. Excuse me. So I'm going to ask you to all relax into your chairs. Just relax where you are right now. And we're going to breathe in through our nose and out through our mouth. So we're going to breathe in through our nose and out through our mouth. Now, what we do in self-directed healing is we say things out loud. So if you're in a private and uninterrupted space, that's going to work really well. And if you're not, then just say them in your mind. It's up to you, whatever feels safe and comfortable for you. So you're breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And thank you, everyone, for turning your cameras on. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes, and you're just going to follow my voice. So as you gently close your eyes, you're just following my voice. And if it doesn't feel safe to close your eyes, that's okay. Just gently lower them, whatever feels safe for you, so that you can really begin to start relaxing into your chair. So just focus on getting really comfortable and relaxing into that position that you've chosen. And we're going to just start breathing in through our nose and out through our mouth. And I'm just going to stop that recording. Can you all see my screen okay? It's got the bit of a cloud. Great. So as I said earlier, when it comes to grief, pain is inevitable, but the suffering that we feel, that's optional. And so this is about, really playing through those stories and the suffering and the limiting beliefs. We've got to work with all that so that we're not suffering, so that we are processing the emotion as it comes up, and it just becomes very fluid, just riding those waves. So when we talk about loss, our loss is one aspect of our life. It doesn't define us. And many grievers, myself included, identify with the loss. So I've had to work around this because I really identify, and I still do from time to time. I still, we're all a work in progress, but I'll identify as a bereaved parent. And it can, for some people, I am a bereaved parent, of course, but it can become an identity and it can change the way you behave in society. And so please understand, for everybody, our life is so much more than our loss. It's one aspect. It's something awful that we're carrying, but it doesn't have to define us. Grief is the price we pay for love, because grief is our love. And so this grief journey, it's finding our way through that pain towards the love. And as I've said, it's honoring their life, because your loved one is so much more than their death, so much more. And so it's really honoring that, honoring them, honoring yourself, honoring the relationship that you had, that you shared. Now, we have covered a lot. We've talked about grief, coming up out of order again, tips for coping and healing with loss. I've talked about what happens when grief is traumatic, and a little bit about trauma. We looked at the grief timeline, and we also looked at tips for supporting people in grief and how to process the emotions. So I've literally brushed the surface. I could talk on this topic for days. So I do want to say, especially for those of you that are grieving, whenever I run this class in the future, you are welcome to come back. I know a couple of you here have seen this before, and I really encourage that, because you cannot take in all this information at once. And so seeing it more than once, you'll pick up different things at different times. Grief brain is a real thing. So, sometimes we need to repeat it to get more out of it. But also at different stages within our grief, different things will talk to you. So please, anybody, you're welcome to come back. Anyone you're working with, please invite them. I will be running a festive edition of the Grief Masterclass November, December sometime. I haven't got a date yet for that, but keep an eye out for that. So remember, you've got the links. Everyone's welcome to book in a free discovery call. Please share that. I see it, the more people I reach, the more people I help, and the world becomes a better place. So when it comes to doing this work, it's so incredibly powerful and meaningful, empowering. We want to feel empowered in our loss. And for me personally, I honor myself, Aaron, every time I do this. And I'm doing it because I really do want to make a difference. So I trust that you gain lots of value out of this session. I shared a lot of information, but ultimately, this is about changing lives. And for those of you working in this space, thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's such powerful work, and we need you. The more people that work in this space and that help others, it's an absolute blessing to this world. So thank you, everybody. I will close, take questions. Any questions that you had at all, please ask, and I will stop sharing my screen. So please stay on. I'm not on a time frame here. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. So thank you, everyone. If you need to go, thank you. And I hope to connect with you again soon.